Samantha Doyle had never planned to live in a place like this. Tucked into the foothills just outside of a mid-sized Oregon town, her new home wasn't flashy or oversized. It was deliberate. The sloped lot had been a selling point, with a natural stream trickling along the edge of the property, shaded by pine and alder trees that reminded her of the childhood summers she'd spent camping with her dad. After years in a noisy city condo, post-divorce and post-burnout, she was ready for silence that wasn't empty and space that wasn't shared. She wasn't running from anything, but there was certainly nothing she'd wanted to stay for. This house wasn't an escape. It was a clean slate, a practical decision disguised as a dream. The structure itself was modest but functional, a single-story home with reinforced foundations and modern drainage systems. A must on sloped ground. Samantha, a licensed physiotherapist who ran her own small clinic downtown, had reviewed every inspection report, every environmental assessment, every easement agreement. She wasn't careless nor naive. In fact, she prided herself on being detail-oriented, the kind of person who read disclosures cover to cover and highlighted in different colors depending on the category of risk. She had purchased the property specifically because it lay outside the jurisdiction of the local property association, something the realtor had practically whispered, as if it were a dirty secret rather than a selling point. But Samantha had smiled and nodded. She preferred independence, even if it meant being the outlier in a tightly wound neighborhood of legacy residents and retired administrators who believed fences should be beige, trees should be trimmed quarterly, and lawns watered regardless of the weather. Karen McBain, who lived uphill in the much older, larger house that loomed above Samantha's property line, had introduced herself the same day the movers left. Wide-hipped and heavy-footed, with a short haircut that framed her sun-damaged face like a helmet, Karen carried herself like someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Her first words hadn't been welcome or nice to meet you. They'd been, we need to talk about runoff. Samantha had blinked, sweat still drying on her neck from the morning's unpacking, and raised an eyebrow. Karen gestured at the slope and muttered something about historical channels, migratory erosion, and wildlife patterns. Samantha tried to be polite, nodding while letting most of it roll past her like the very water Karen was so concerned with. She knew what this was. Not environmental stewardship, but power dressed up in eco-concern. Karen didn't care about the stream. She cared about control, and Samantha's autonomy disrupted the illusion that she still had it. That interaction ended with Karen handing her a neatly printed pamphlet titled Community Water Flow Guidelines, complete with diagrams and bulleted expectations, none of which held any legal authority. Samantha didn't say anything at the time. She tucked the pamphlet into the recycling and returned to hanging her kitchen hooks, unaware that the woman from uphill wasn't just eccentric. Karen was the type of neighbor who saw disagreement as provocation and neutrality as defiance. And now, with gravity quite literally on her side, Karen had found her perfect battleground. It had rained for days. Not a light drizzle either, but the kind of heavy, unrelenting rain that turned backyards into small marshes and driveways into slow-moving rivers. Samantha had spent most of that weekend indoors, catching up on clinic paperwork and enjoying the simple pleasure of listening to the water drum steadily against her windows. It was a familiar sound, one she welcomed, proof that nature still functioned the way it was supposed to. She trusted the land she had bought. The drainage studies she had reviewed before purchasing the house were thorough, and the engineers had been confident that the gentle slope combined with the designed runoff paths would protect her property from any flood risks. She had no reason to doubt it, at least not until the morning she stepped into her downstairs utility room and felt water lapping against her bare feet. For a few seconds, Samantha simply stared down, as if her mind couldn't quite bridge the gap between what she knew should be true and what she was experiencing. The concrete floor was submerged under several inches of muddy, debris-laden water. Cardboard boxes that had once held spare supplies floated at awkward angles, their contents ruined. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something foul and chemical. Panic didn't immediately set in. Samantha's instincts were too pragmatic for that. She retreated upstairs without rushing, grabbed her phone and called the emergency restoration service, whose number she had saved the day she moved in. While she waited for them to arrive, she turned off the main power breaker and started snapping photos, documenting everything as methodically as she could. When the crew finally showed up, a trio of soaked, serious-looking men, they wasted no time setting up pumps to begin draining the water. As they worked, Samantha moved carefully through the house, assessing the damage. The water had spread farther than she had realized. It had seeped through the baseboards and saturated the walls, pooling under furniture and shorting out several appliances. A specialist with a moisture reader confirmed what she feared. The drywall would have to be torn out at least 3 feet up in affected areas. The damage wasn't cosmetic. It was structural, electrical, and deeply expensive. The insurance adjuster, a woman named Marcy with a calm demeanor and an efficient clip to her voice, arrived later that afternoon. Samantha walked her through the property, pointing out where the water had infiltrated and explaining that her home was designed to handle stormwater. Marcy took detailed notes, occasionally murmuring to herself as she reviewed Samantha's policy. When they reached the backyard, Marcy frowned, squinting up the slope toward Karen's property. Something about the terrain was off. Instead of natural channels guiding rainwater away, there were several visible disruptions. Mounds of earth, loosely stacked sandbags, even what looked like a shallow trench dug perpendicular to the incline. "Did you do any landscaping recently?" Marcy asked, almost casually. "No," Samantha said immediately. "Nothing that would alter the water flow." Marcy nodded but said nothing further. She knelt to examine the ground where muddy rivulets had carved deep grooves leading directly into Samantha's foundation. Samantha followed her gaze uphill, where a makeshift barrier of sandbags and plywood now sat across what had once been a natural depression in the land. She hadn't noticed it before. Too focused on moving in, too trusting that no one would be reckless enough to tamper with the drainage. Later that evening, while scrolling through her neighborhood forum, Samantha found a post that made her stomach twist. Karen had proudly uploaded photos from what she called the Community Water Protection Action, a gathering that had taken place during the heaviest downpour, with Karen and a group of her sympathizers posing in ponchos and rubber boots as they rearranged the landscape on her upper lot. The caption boasted about saving the hillside from invasive erosion caused by careless new residents who refused to maintain traditional runoff paths. The comments were a mixture of polite applause and cautious approval, with a few neighbors expressing concern over whether permits had been obtained. Samantha stared at the images, recognizing the exact barriers she had seen earlier, and her throat tightened. This wasn't an accident. Karen's group had actively, deliberately altered the land without any consultation or permission, and in doing so, they had redirected the full force of a storm straight into Samantha's home. The weight of the realization hit hard, heavier than the financial cost or the hours of reconstruction she now faced. It was the knowledge that someone had chosen to prioritize a personal vendetta over basic safety, using the language of environmental concern as a cover for recklessness. The next morning before work, Samantha made 2 calls, one to her lawyer and one to a licensed civil engineer she found through a reputable firm. She wasn't going to confront Karen directly. Not yet. Emotion would only cloud what needed to be done with precision. Samantha wasn't interested in neighborhood drama or shouting matches across property lines. She intended to move forward exactly the way she did in her professional life. Gather evidence, verify facts, prepare her case meticulously, and act only when the outcome was inevitable. This wasn't personal revenge. It was survival. It was the defense of her home, her livelihood, and her right to live without being undermined by the reckless self-importance of a neighbor who believed she was above consequences. And Samantha had no intention of losing. By midweek, Samantha was already operating with a level of focus she hadn't tapped into since her final licensing exams years ago. Every move was methodical. Every conversation was documented. She had stopped thinking of Karen as just a nuisance and had started viewing her as a genuine legal threat, one capable of inflicting serious financial harm if left unchecked. The civil engineer she hired, Alan Becker, arrived on a cold, overcast morning, clipboard in hand, boots thick with clay before he even reached the side of the house. Alan wasn't theatrical or prone to exaggeration. He spent nearly 2 hours walking the property, taking elevation measurements, inspecting the drainage paths, and studying the improvised barriers Karen's protest group had installed. His verdict, delivered in his calm, matter-of-fact tone, was chillingly straightforward. The altered landscape above had not just contributed to the flooding, it had directly caused it. The land's natural runoff patterns had been entirely disrupted, funneling water down in a concentrated, accelerated force that Samantha's foundation had no chance of resisting. When Samantha asked about the legal implications, Alan didn't hesitate. If she modified her land in a way that damaged yours, she's liable. It's textbook negligence. Armed with the preliminary report, Samantha's lawyer Daniel Keene took immediate action. He drafted a formal demand letter addressed to Karen McBain, outlining the situation in explicit terms. The letter cited the altered terrain, referenced the photographic evidence from the neighborhood forum, attached a copy of the engineer's findings, and demanded full compensation for damages under the doctrine of private nuisance and negligent land alteration. The letter was delivered by courier, requiring signature upon receipt, a small but necessary measure to ensure there would be no plausible deniability later. Karen did not respond well. Within 48 hours, Samantha found herself the recipient of a series of passive-aggressive messages posted to the local community board. Karen painted herself as the victim, claiming she had merely attempted to responsibly mitigate environmental erosion that new construction had exacerbated. She implied that Samantha, by building without properly maintaining historical water paths, had endangered the entire hillside. Some neighbors, too polite or too uninformed, chimed in with half-hearted support while others remained conspicuously silent. Samantha refused to engage publicly. She understood the game Karen was playing, twisting the narrative to confuse, to obscure, to blur the lines until no one remembered who had thrown the first stone. But the real escalation came 2 days later. Samantha returned home after a long day at the clinic to find a bright orange envelope taped to her front door. An official notice from the Municipal Code Enforcement Office. Someone, Karen, it was obvious, had filed a complaint accusing Samantha of illegal grading and unpermitted alterations to the drainage systems on her lot. The accusation was absurd. Samantha hadn't so much as dug a trench since she moved in. Still, now there was a pending investigation, and until it was resolved, all repair work to the flood-damaged areas had to be suspended. No drywall replacement, no foundation sealing, no electrical rewiring. Her home remained in a vulnerable, semi-ruined state because of a petty, retaliatory filing. Samantha called Daniel immediately, her voice tight with frustration. He was already 2 steps ahead. "We'll respond formally, file a counterclaim, request discovery on her property modifications." "She wants to play games." "Fine. We'll turn over every rock on that hillside." His calm professionalism was reassuring, but Samantha felt the slow boil of fury underneath her skin. This wasn't just a legal dispute anymore, it was personal sabotage. Karen wasn't trying to win anything tangible. She was trying to exhaust her, financially, emotionally, mentally. It was a war of attrition, and Karen was betting that Samantha, as the newcomer without deep neighborhood roots, would fold first. Instead, Samantha dug in. She moved important documents and valuables to a climate-controlled storage unit across town, rented a small industrial dehumidifier to run day and night, and scheduled temporary accommodations with a friend. If Karen thought making the house unlivable would drive her out, she had underestimated her badly. Samantha was patient when she needed to be. More importantly, she understood how systems worked. City offices, insurance protocols, civil courts. She didn't need Karen's approval or the court of public opinion to win. She needed documentation, persistence, and an unshakable record of doing everything by the book. Meanwhile, Alan's second, more detailed report arrived. This time, it included high-resolution drone photographs, clearly showing the man-made obstructions on Karen's land. Obstructions that not only blocked natural flow, but actually pulled stormwater against the slope, exacerbating its downward force. Copies of these images were immediately submitted to the municipal investigator assigned to Samantha's case, along with affidavits from the flood restoration crew and the insurance adjuster. Samantha didn't confront Karen directly. She didn't need shouting matches over fences or angry doorbell ringing scenes. She understood something far more critical. Paper trails were more devastating than insults. Official reports were more lethal than gossip. Still, the personal cost was mounting. Sleep became elusive. Samantha found herself waking up at odd hours, mentally cataloging timelines, rehearsing worst-case scenarios, recalculating her repair estimates. Friends offered sympathy, but few truly understood the feeling of being attacked, not with weapons or fists, but with bureaucracy, lies, and petty malice, hidden under a thin veneer of civic responsibility. It was a quieter kind of violence, but it was violence all the same. One evening, as Samantha stood at her backyard fence, surveying the battered landscape in the fading twilight, she saw Karen standing up the hill, arms crossed over her wide chest, watching her. They stared at each other for a long moment, neither speaking, the silent standoff saying more than words ever could. Samantha didn't wave. She didn't nod. She turned her back and went inside without a word, leaving Karen to stand alone in the gathering dark. Samantha knew then that this wasn't going to burn out quickly. Karen was entrenched, convinced of her own righteousness, and unwilling to accept the consequences of her actions. But Samantha also understood something else, something that filled her with a cold, determined calm. Karen might be used to winning through intimidation, but she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated her opponent. Samantha wasn't fighting for power or status. She was fighting for her home, her dignity, and her right to live free from someone else's delusions of authority. And she was prepared to fight until the very end. The tide began to turn not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet meeting in a cramped conference room on the second floor of a nondescript municipal building. Samantha had arrived early as always, armed with a binder of documentation prepared by her attorney and organized with surgical precision. Across the table sat two officials from the city's code enforcement division and an independent environmental compliance auditor. They had called the meeting to discuss the competing complaints between her and Karen, allegations of unauthorized modifications, stormwater violations, and unsafe conditions. The air was stale with recycled heat, and the walls were lined with faded maps of the county's zoning designations. It wasn't glamorous, but Samantha understood the importance of this moment. If the city ruled in her favor, the narrative would shift decisively. No longer would this be a petty neighborhood spat. It would be a confirmed violation, official, actionable, and devastating for Karen's self-styled authority. Daniel, her lawyer, began the presentation with professional calm, walking the officials through the timeline. The installation of unauthorized barriers, the photographic evidence from the community forum, the flooding incident, and the subsequent sabotage complaint Karen had filed. He played drone footage from Alan Becker's engineering report, pausing at keyframes to highlight how Karen's sandbag wall obstructed the slope's natural runoff, and how the trench her group had dug acted as a chute directing water toward Samantha's foundation. When he finished, the auditor, a woman named Lisa Graves, leaned forward and asked a single question that sliced through the procedural fog. Were there any permits issued for this earthwork? Daniel answered with a clipped no, and the silence that followed was telling. Karen had not shown up in person, sending a local real estate attorney in her place. A man who seemed flustered and underprepared. His rebuttal consisted mostly of vague references to community standards and pre-existing pathways, but he had no maps, no expert testimony, no data. The officials listened politely but unimpressed. One of them asked pointedly whether the alterations had been reported or disclosed prior to their completion. The attorney stammered through a half-hearted defense about emergency erosion control. But it was clear from their expressions that the officials had heard enough of those excuses before. 3 days later, Samantha received a letter confirming what she had hoped for. The city's compliance review had found Karen in violation of multiple local ordinances. The barriers had to be removed. The trench had to be filled and stabilized. Further modification of the slope required formal engineering oversight and permit approval. More than that, the investigation into Karen's complaint against Samantha had been closed without merit. The stop work order on Samantha's repairs was lifted effective immediately. It was by every measure a procedural win, but for Samantha it felt more like an emotional recalibration. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a full night's sleep, uninterrupted by visions of collapsing walls or bank account balances. But peace was short-lived. With official pressure now mounting on Karen, the woman doubled down in unpredictable ways. First came the sign, an 8-foot placard Karen erected at the top of her lot, facing down the hill like a billboard. "This land resists manipulation," it read in block letters, followed by an incoherent manifesto about hydrology, respect, and outsider influence. Then came the mulch dump. One morning, Samantha woke to find a heaping pile of fresh mulch poured right on the boundary line between their properties, partially on her side, seeping into her carefully repaired drainage swale. It wasn't subtle, it was a message. Instead of reacting with anger, Samantha photographed everything and sent it to Daniel, who forwarded the evidence to the city's legal department and the environmental auditor. He advised patience. Every provocation was now more proof of Karen's pattern of hostility and disregard for the law. But what Samantha hadn't anticipated was the structural consequence of Karen's obstinance. It started with a rumble. Just past midnight on a Saturday, Samantha woke to the sound of something heavy shifting. At first, she thought it might have been thunder. Then she noticed her motion sensor light had tripped, casting a pale glow over the yard. She stepped outside onto the back porch, robe wrapped tightly around her, and saw it. A section of Karen's retaining wall, the oldest part, had buckled. Mud and sod had spilled out in a wave, carrying mulch, bricks, and runoff water. It hadn't reached Samantha's home, but it was close, and it was clear that any further rain could tip the balance. The ground above was saturated. Karen's DIY landscape alterations had destabilized the slope. Samantha didn't call Karen. She didn't bang on the door or leave a note. She called the non-emergency city line, reported a potential landslide hazard, and sent Alan Becker the footage from her security camera that showed the wall collapse. Within 48 hours, the city dispatched a geotechnical engineer to assess the damage. His report, filed promptly and shared with both parties, warned of imminent risk to structures on Karen's lot if immediate mitigation wasn't performed. The cost of repair? Preliminary estimates neared $500,000. It was a grim irony. Karen, in her obsessive quest to control her neighbor's water flow, had triggered a chain reaction that now endangered her own home. And unlike Samantha, she didn't have a carefully crafted paper trail or engineering support. She had a yard full of illegal alterations, a pending code violation, and a municipal record now reflecting her negligence. Samantha didn't feel triumphant. She felt vindicated, yes, but also saddened by the sheer waste of it all. The money, the energy, the months of stress that could have been avoided if her neighbor had chosen cooperation over hostility. But there was no room for sentiment now. The slope was shifting, both literally and legally. Samantha had held her ground not by shouting louder, but by preparing better. The balance had tipped, and now Karen's fortress on the hill stood on nothing more than softened earth and stubborn pride. The situation deteriorated quickly after the collapse of the retaining wall. The structural integrity of Karen's property, already compromised by months of misguided alterations and negligent drainage redirection, was now officially classified as unstable by city engineers. The weight of saturated earth pressing down from the upper lot threatened not just Samantha's home, but several other properties down the slope. The city issued a formal remediation order, demanding that Karen initiate emergency stabilization under the supervision of a certified geotechnical firm. The timeline was strict: 30 days to begin corrective work, and any failure to comply would result in fines and possible civil liability. Samantha read the notice with grim satisfaction. She hadn't orchestrated this downfall, but it was unfolding exactly the way it should when people played dangerous games with natural forces they didn't understand. Karen, however, did not respond with humility. Instead of hiring the professionals required by law, she erected another sign in her yard, this time accusing city officials of collusion with outsiders to undermine local land rights. She hosted another protest, though the turnout was pitiful compared to the earlier ones. A handful of her most loyal allies, many of them retired and unaware of the full scope of the violations, stood with handmade signs about environmental justice and property autonomy. Samantha didn't watch. She had cameras now, positioned discreetly but effectively to capture any further tampering or intrusion. She didn't trust Karen to do nothing. In fact, she was certain that with her back against the wall, Karen would lash out. She was right. On a cold Tuesday morning, Samantha's contractor, hired to begin reconstruction of her foundation wall, called her out to the property with a concern. He had found foreign material embedded deep in the runoff path behind the house. Concrete rubble, garbage bags filled with soil, and broken tiles that did not match any part of Samantha's house. It was clear sabotage, an attempt to redirect or block water again, just as the rainy season returned. Worse, several of the buried items contained sharp metal fragments, rusted nails, and broken glass, enough to damage equipment or cause injury if left undetected. The implications were serious. Not only was Karen refusing to take responsibility for her own collapsing property, but she was now actively endangering Samantha's contractors and further delaying the already costly repair process. Daniel filed an emergency complaint with the city's legal division, attaching photo documentation and an affidavit from the contractor. The response was swift. Karen received a formal cease and desist order forbidding her from entering within 10 feet of the shared boundary without a neutral third-party monitor present. She was also warned that any future attempt to alter terrain without a permit would result in criminal charges. This was no longer just civil territory. Karen had crossed into liability and potential prosecution. Samantha hoped that would be the final nail, the moment of forced clarity that would make Karen step back and accept the reality she had created. But instead, the woman disappeared for several days, and when she returned, it was with something worse than sabotage. It was with lawyers. Karen filed a lawsuit against Samantha, claiming that her construction project and the original grading on her lot had induced slope destabilization and contributed to the collapse of her retaining wall. It was a weak, poorly structured legal maneuver built more on emotion and false assumptions than evidence. But it was still a lawsuit, and it meant time, money, and disruption. Samantha met with Daniel the same afternoon. He explained that while the suit was baseless, they would still have to respond formally, appear in court, and spend weeks navigating depositions and preliminary motions. Samantha felt exhaustion flood her chest. After everything, the flooding, the damage, the code violations, Karen was still trying to spin the story in her favor. She wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to stall, to outlast Samantha through procedural attrition, and once again, the neighborhood began murmuring. This time, however, the dynamic had shifted. Samantha began receiving private messages from neighbors she had never spoken to. People offering their quiet support, sharing stories of past conflicts with Karen, complaints that had been brushed aside or ignored. One couple down the street revealed that years ago, Karen had tried to force them to cut down a row of heritage oaks, claiming they blocked her solar panels. Another neighbor confided that Karen had falsely reported them to animal control over a barking dog that turned out not to be theirs. These were whispers, yes, but they were consistent, and they painted a picture of someone who had bullied from behind a mask of moral concern for years. Samantha gathered these accounts, verified them where possible, and passed them along to Daniel. Not all would be admissible in court, but they reinforced the pattern of behavior now well established through hard evidence. More importantly, they offered a kind of emotional insulation, proof that Samantha wasn't alone in this anymore. Karen had created enemies through every smug declaration and manipulative complaint. Now, as her house literally began to crumble beneath her, those same neighbors watched from a distance, unwilling to intervene. The next rainfall arrived exactly 1 week before Karen's court appearance, and this time the damage was unmistakable. A second section of her retaining wall gave way, pulling part of her deck down with it. The soil underneath her back patio shifted visibly, cracking the foundation slab and destabilizing a portion of her kitchen. Samantha watched the footage from her side yard camera in silence. No celebration, no glee, just a quiet confirmation of inevitability. Karen had been warned repeatedly and had ignored every voice that tried to steer her toward reason. Now nature had delivered its verdict. Emergency crews arrived late that night, called in by Karen herself after a loud, cracking sound startled her awake. Her home was now considered unsafe for habitation. The city placed red tags on the doors. She was forced to vacate the premises under escort and was provided a list of required geotechnical remedies before she would be allowed to return. The damage was estimated at well over $500,000. Most of which was not covered by insurance due to the classified negligence and unauthorized earthwork. For Samantha, it was not a moment of victory, but of release. The battle had taken its toll, emotionally, financially, physically, but she had not faltered. She had answered every attack not with outrage, but with documentation, with expertise, with calm professionalism. And in the end, she had remained standing, while the one who tried to bury her beneath mud and fear had collapsed under the weight of her own defiance. The courthouse smelled like dust and paper. Samantha sat in the hallway outside the hearing room, the heavy manila folder in her lap containing every document, photo, and report that had shaped the last 3 months of her life. Her lawyer, Daniel, reviewed a final list of citations and quietly tapped his pen against the edge of his tablet. Karen had arrived 15 minutes late, dressed in a suit 2 sizes too small, and followed closely by a man who looked like he'd been pulled from a tax law seminar and dropped into civil litigation. Her demeanor was brittle, tense, and combative. She didn't look at Samantha, not once, though her presence was loud, an aura of indignation and defense wrapped in too much perfume and too little self-awareness. Inside, the courtroom was small and utilitarian. The judge, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a military efficiency to her tone, wasted no time. This was a preliminary hearing meant to establish the facts and determine whether the suit Karen had filed would proceed to civil trial. Karen's lawyer led with accusations that Samantha's initial landscape grading had led to slope instability, that she had manipulated the drainage channels in a way that endangered neighboring properties, and that she had instigated a vendetta against Karen in retaliation for community concerns. It was a mess of unfounded claims, all speculative and presented without a single piece of engineering data. Daniel stood, his voice calm but with a deliberate edge. He presented the certified engineering reports from Alan Becker, drone images showing Karen's alterations, city notices citing her for code violations, and the geotechnical hazard assessment that explicitly attributed the retaining wall failure to unpermitted modifications. He didn't embellish. He let the documents speak. When the judge asked for clarity on the permit status, Daniel handed over stamped letters from the city's planning office. Karen's attorney looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Then came the testimony from the contractor who had discovered debris and sabotage in Samantha's drainage trench. He spoke clearly, professionally, confirming under oath that the material had been recently buried and did not originate from Samantha's home. The judge took notes quickly, eyes narrowing as he described the jagged shards and deliberate blockage patterns. It was a turning point. The room shifted, but the most damning blow came when Lisa Graves, the environmental auditor, took the stand via video link. She summarized her findings, citing specific regulatory breaches, the violation of erosion control standards, and the timeline of Karen's non-compliance. She referred to the situation not as an accident, but as a cascading failure of responsibility, triggered by willful disregard for hydrological integrity. Karen's lawyer objected to the terminology. The judge overruled it. When it came time for closing statements, Karen's representative faltered. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been dismantled. He gestured vaguely at community friction and good faith attempts to protect the hillside. Daniel, in contrast, simply reiterated the chain of events. One neighbor followed the law, the other did not. One neighbor sought expertise, the other dismissed it. One home stood, the other had to be condemned. The judge didn't deliberate long. Her ruling was firm and comprehensive. Karen's suit was dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the court recognized the substantial body of evidence, indicating that Karen had knowingly and recklessly modified her property in a way that caused harm to Samantha's. While Samantha had not filed a cross-claim yet, the court would honor its jurisdiction over such action should she choose to proceed. The room was silent as the gavel dropped. Outside the courtroom, Karen didn't speak. She turned sharply on her heel and marched toward the exit, her face flushed with a deep, bitter red. The crowd that once might have supported her had dwindled to nothing. The last few neighbors who'd shown up out of curiosity or loyalty avoided her gaze. No one walked with her. No one offered a word. Samantha didn't gloat. She stood in place, watching Karen vanish into the parking lot, her suit wrinkled and soaked with sweat. Her posture no longer defiant but defensive, like a wall folding inward. It was over, at least the legal part. Karen had been held accountable in the clearest terms possible, and yet Samantha knew there was no real victory here. There was only consequence. The following week, Karen's insurance company issued a statement formally denying her claim. The findings of the court, in conjunction with the independent engineering reports and the city's enforcement actions, classified the damage to her home as resulting from gross negligence. She would receive nothing. The estimate for stabilization alone exceeded $400,000. Full restoration, if it could even be done, would surpass $500,000. Karen quietly began renting a small unit on the outskirts of town, her home red-tagged and unsellable. Meanwhile, Samantha began the final phase of her own restoration. The water damage had been repaired, new perimeter drainage installed, and the landscape around the slope reinforced with professionally engineered terracing and root-stabilizing vegetation. It wasn't cheap, but it was secure, and for the first time in weeks she stood in her yard without scanning for threats, without the weight of legal action waiting behind a knock on the door. She didn't throw a party. She didn't celebrate. She took a quiet evening walk down her property line, noting the way the newly planted ground cover held fast in the fading light. She sipped tea on the porch and let herself breathe. Not because she had won, but because she had endured. Karen had underestimated her because Samantha didn't shout, didn't provoke, didn't fight dirty. But she had fought, and she had done it with a clarity and precision that had cut through months of chaos like a scalpel. This was the end of the battle, and it had been hers all along. In the months that followed, the neighborhood began to shift in tone. Without Karen's towering presence at the center of every minor dispute and unsolicited regulation, the atmosphere gradually lightened. Conversations returned to small things. Gardening tips, book exchanges, the occasional borrowed tool, freed from the undercurrent of surveillance and passive-aggressive posturing. The sign Karen had once nailed to her front tree was quietly removed by someone in the night, its warped wood discarded near the curb like a relic of a past no one wanted to remember. Her house, now surrounded by caution tape and erosion fencing, stood as a silent warning of what happens when pride is mistaken for authority and manipulation for leadership. The property value plummeted. Prospective buyers came and went, but even the most optimistic investors hesitated at the combination of structural instability and legal baggage. Samantha, meanwhile, returned to her routines. Not because the past months hadn't left marks, but because she refused to let them define her. She rebuilt her foundation both literally and metaphorically, investing not just in her home's physical recovery, but in her sense of stability and place. She reconnected with her work at the clinic with a deeper sense of focus, finding a strange, quiet strength in knowing that she had endured something most would have buckled under. The neighbors who had once kept their distance now greeted her with familiarity, even respect. She didn't become the new figurehead of the neighborhood, nor did she try to. But when a local family asked her advice on managing their own drainage project, she gave it without hesitation. Clear, informed, and grounded in hard-won experience. Karen was not seen again after winter. Word spread that she had moved to another county to live with a cousin. There was no farewell, no explanation, and certainly no apology. But Samantha didn't need one. The damage had spoken louder than any confession ever could. There was peace now, not because the conflict had vanished, but because it had been seen through to its end. The land, once torn and redirected, was healing, and so was she.